Scandinavians have traveled eastward since ancient times. The trade route of Eastern Europe flourished during the Viking Age, when Nordic merchants called Varjags traveled as far as Baghdad. According to one Iranian writer, they even reached Al-Sin, China. In excavated graves at Birka, archaeologists have found Chinese silks from the Tang dynasty. One of my favorite findings is a purse made from the skin of a Komodo dragon, a large lizard native to India and Southeast Asia. They brought home other goods, spices, glassware, and vast hoards of Arabic silver. In their dealings with the Khazars and the Caliphate, it was inevitable that the Varjags would encounter the third major player in the Middle East, the eastern remnant of the Roman Empire, posthumously called Byzantium. The Norse called it Griecium, land of the Greeks. Their splendorous capital is now the largest city in Europe, Istanbul, known then as Constantinople. To the Norse, it was Miklagarfur, the great city. To any brave soul who dared to cross the Varjag Sea, the wild rapids and frozen plains, great adventures and greater riches beckoned in the greatest city on earth. We don't know for sure when the Greeks and Scandinavians first learned of each other. A large amount of Orthodox Christians inhabited the Khazar realm, and in the latter half of the 9th century, Muslims wrote how the Varjags paid custom duties to the Byzantines, probably in Crimea. In the 820s, the emperor was involved in Catholic efforts to convert Denmark and Sweden, primarily through the bishop, Ansgar. The oldest surviving document we have describing a direct link are the Annals of St. Bertin from 839. A delegation of Swedish diplomats had visited Byzantium. They claimed to be from the tribe of Rus and subjects to a king called Chaganus. We don't know what they wanted exactly. The annals said amicitae, friendship. Whatever the Swedes or Byzantines wanted, it is believed they had diplomatic ties across the Viking world. Byzantine officials would carry with them copper coins and imperial seals. Examples of these, dating back to the mid-800s, have been discovered at Viking capitals like Hedeby, Birka, and Holmgardur, believed by many historians to have been the stronghold of the so-called Chaganus. The primary chronicle, written by a Russian monk in the 12th century, is one of the primary sources when researching Eastern European history. It claims that the Scandinavians first established contact with Byzantium in 852. It is entirely possible, but we have no way of confirming this. Historians consider the chronicle unreliable, and rarely cite it without additional evidence from archaeology or more reliable sources. For example, the chronicle claims that in 866, the Vikings launched an attack on Byzantium. The description by Patriarch Photios, who defended the city during the attack, dates it to 860. He likened it to a thunderbolt, 200 ships assaulting the coastal settlements and suburbs, sparing neither humans nor animals. He described them as an obscure nation, a nation of no account, a nation ranked among slaves, unknown, a nation dwelling somewhere far from our country, barbarous, nomadic, armed with arrogance, unwatched, unchallenged, leaderless. Though the Vikings were unable to scale the Constantine walls, they made a point of sailing past them, raising their blades, as if to threaten the city with death by the sword. But on the way home, the fleet succumbed to a terrible storm. Perhaps this prompted their next response. An unknown time later, they asked for conversion. By 867, the Byzantines maintained a bishop and a pastor among the Rus, which they called the Sea Raiders of Eastern Europe. Though the mission reported success, no evidence exists to confirm it. To the contrary, archaeology points to the Viking strongholds of Holmgardur and Aldeigjuborg having burned down in the 860s and 870s, possibly as a result of political upheaval. In the final years of the 9th century, the Scandinavians established themselves in the city of Kiev. From there they plotted their next move on Byzantium. Historians debate on what the next move involved exactly. According to the primary chronicle, Prince Oleg of Rus led a fleet of 2,000 ships and attacked the city. The Golden Horn, the waterway to Byzantium, had been sealed off by a chain, but Oleg circumvented the chain by putting his ships on wheels and sailing them on land past the blockage. The Turks would use a similar method when they finally conquered the city in 1453. But Oleg, like his predecessors, failed to take the Constantine walls, claiming instead a tribute for every ship in his fleet. He sailed home with a bounty of gold, silk, fruits and wine, his ships now flying sails of nettle cloth. This fantastical account can not be corroborated by any other source, and most historians consider it a fantasy. In 911 we know for certain that a treaty was signed between Emperor Leo VI and the Rus. It began by listing 15 representatives of the Rus people, sent by Oleg, Grand Prince of the Rus. Of note here is that most of the names are Norse in origin, and the outliers are actually Finnish. Simultaneously, the Rus swore to uphold the treaty on their gods, Perun and Volos, both of which are Slavic. These clues indicate the Scandinavian influence among the Rus, but also its multi-ethnic character. Rus had previously denoted raiders and merchants, but now it came to mean a people. The treaty listed 10 points concerning treatment of the Rus in Byzantium. It included, but was not limited to, rules regarding murder, manslaughter, theft, stranded ships, inheritance, ransoming of prisoners, and so on. For the Byzantines, this treaty was all about politics. By engaging the Rus in trade, they eliminated them as a threat. But to the Rus, it was entirely economical. They could now return to their prince with great news. They had unlocked the riches of the world's greatest city. From across the Viking world, the news spread like wildfire. Back home in Scandinavia, merchants prepared their light vessels for the long and profitable journey. Those tribes most active in the eastern trade were the Gotlanders and the Sviar. Sviar are different from modern Swedes in that they inhabited only the region of Svealand, not the entirety of the eastern Scandinavian peninsula. However, in English and Latin, the words are the same, Swedish, so I will call them Swedes for the rest of the video. Archaeological evidence points to the Sviar showing greater interest in settling down along the eastern route and establishing themselves among the locals, whilst the Gotlanders were primarily traveling merchants. According to the Guta Saga, a medieval legislation describing the island's history, the Gotlanders submitted themselves to the Swedish king somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries. This allowed them duty-free trade across the Swedish realm and Swedish sphere of influence. Though the accuracy of these sagas can be put into question, the relationship between Gotland and Svealand appears to have been symbiotic indeed. In the previous part of the series, I discussed the boats they used on the Östervegur, but I didn't discuss what goods they brought with them from home. Most likely, it was metal. Scandinavia is rich in minerals, and Gotlanders appear to have been among the first Norsemen to produce iron. The raw minerals were primarily fished from bogs, instead of being mined. Viking swords have been found all across Eastern Europe, and they were renowned among the Muslims. Many of the swords had been imported from the Franks, but the Scandinavians likely brought raw minerals or ingots to trade with the tribes, or even jewelry, which are very often found along the route. Before the trade deal with the Byzantines, the Swedes and Gotlanders had primarily traveled via Finland and Estonia into Lake Ladoga, entering the Volga River, and continued to Khazaria and the Abbasid Caliphate. In the 10th century, a new road opened up for trade with Byzantium, going via Latvia. The modern-day country of Latvia did not exist in the Viking Age. The territory was divided between several Proto-Latvian tribes, like the Curonians, Semi-Gallians, Latgalians, and Selonians. These people had been engaged with international trade since a very long while. The region was the endpoint of the so-called Amber Road, trading amber all the way to Egypt. The Gotlanders appear to have taken an early interest in this trade. Stone Age burials have been found on said island, featuring Mediterranean seashells. The Latvians have long had ties to Scandinavia. According to legend, they partook in the Battle of Bråvalla in the 8th century. According to the Guta Saga, the Gotlanders built colonies in Latvia before the Viking Age, and to some degree, it has been corroborated by archaeology. Evidence points to Gutish influence in Gorobina and Domale. Some have suggested colonies, but it is disputed. Contemporary sources speak of the Swedes taxing the Latvians, but were pushed out in the 9th century. Around the same time, archaeology points to the Gutish colonies being abandoned. Attempts were made to reconquer the region. Throughout the period, pirates from both regions would attack each other, but this wasn't strange. Norse Vikings would attack fellow Norsemen, and the actions of individuals do not necessarily indicate the attitudes of a culture. Indeed, relations between the Norse and Balts appear to have been friendly. Archaeology hints at shared values, intermarrying, and cultural exchange. A copper container was discovered in Sigtuna. It is engraved with a runic text telling us that it belonged to Dyrfur, and how he was gifted a box by a man from either Zambia or Semgale. So it is only natural that the travelers would try and reach Byzantium via Latvia, and the great river Daugava, known to the Norse as Duna. However, these semi-galleons weren't fools. 22 kilometers from the mouth of the Daugava, violent rapids forced the travelers to bring their boats ashore and carry them to the other side of the rapids. This rendered them vulnerable to attack. Indeed, since the Bronze Age, the locals possessed a hill fort at the site, called Domale, from where they controlled the river traffic. Travelers were made to pay a toll, but they could also use Domale to rest, repair their ships, and trade. Scandinavian metallurgy could be exchanged for such goods as wax, honey, slaves, maybe even amber, all of which the Byzantines were more interested in than iron. Domale is rich with findings of Arabic and European coins, and evidence points to it being a prosperous and multi-ethnic center of trade. Some would even settle down among the locals, marry with them, and be buried along the banks of the river. In the 12th century, Domale would be replaced by the modern city of Riga, located just a few kilometers closer to the sea. Traveling further up the river, they'd meet with other hill forts at Koknes and Jersika, belonging to the Latgalians. Here they would also pay tribute. Then they continued to the site near Polotsk, from whence they could portage their boats to the Dnieper. This river would lead them straight to the Black Sea and Byzantium. In the 10th century, the Daugava route became the most important path to the Dnieper, but it wasn't the only one. The older route to the Dnieper began along the coasts of Finland and Estonia, continuing into the Ladoga, down the river Volkhov into Lake Ilmen. The Swedes had been present in this territory since at least the 9th century, and probably before. They were dominant in such cities as Aldeigjuborg and Holm, the area around which was called Holmgardur. From these settlements they traded and interacted with the local Finns, Slavs, and Estonians, taking many of them along on their sudden expeditions. Finnish hunters were essential in gathering furs, the primary trade good to the Greeks and Abbasids. These furs could have been exchanged for iron, taken as tribute, or even stolen. From Lake Ilmen, the route continued down the river Lovat. Historians have debated how travel down the Lovat occurred exactly. Modern experiments have found the rapids to be quite troublesome, and were apparently more so in the Viking Age. Thus, some have presented the hypothesis that the route was only undertaken in winter, when the waters froze. The boats could either have been pulled over the ice, or exchanged for sleighs at Ladoga or Ilmen. We do know for certain that winter travel occurred, both from the sagas, and even the Mongols preferred to attack in winter, when the swamps froze, and the rivers lay covered in ice. Whether by boat or sleigh, every trip down the Lovat would end in another portage, before reaching the Dnieper. At this portage, smack dab between the Daugava, Lovat, and Dnieper, sat the city of Gnostava. Having been excavated since 1874, it is one of the largest archaeological sites in Europe. It consisted of a fortress, surrounded by rural settlements, and burial mounds. They are the resting places of merchants, warriors, and their wives. Inside we find Thor's hammers and double-edged swords, but also household possessions like copper cauldrons, and an amphora inscribed with the Slavic text, Gorushna. Some say it designated pepper, others mustard. It is possibly the name of a man. From Gnostava, the travelers dragged their boats along another portage. These portages were called voloks, and may have been prepared routes. In later centuries, long roads or bridges were constructed for this purpose. At the end of this volok, they could finally enter the Dnieper, the pounding artery of Garthariki. From here it was smooth sailing down to Kainugarfur, Kiev. According to legend, Kiev was founded by 3 brothers and named it after the oldest, Ki. Boris Rebekov suggested it was the capital of a tribal union by the 1st millennium AD, and though we cannot know for certain, evidence points to it being a trade contact of both the Romans and Byzantines. In the 9th century it appears to have paid tribute to the Khazars, and by the mid-10th century, Scandinavian artifacts start appearing. According to Byzantine sources, the Rus and Varjags would spend their winters here. Together with the chieftains and aristocracy, they would travel around the country on poludi, collecting tributes from the Slavic tribes, while waiting for new boats to be constructed. During spring, these boats would be used for traveling to the Black Sea. Aside from tribute, there was likely a lot of trade with the tribes. Again, the most prominent trade goods brought along were furs, wax, honey, and slaves. The route got progressively riskier. South of Kiev they would enter the territory of the Pechenegs, a hostile tribe of mounted nomads. While the Rus were safe in their boats, they would eventually reach a series of 7 rapids, where they had to beach their craft and carry them over progressively longer distances. One of the rapids was aptly named Don't Fall Asleep, for the horsemen would descend out of nowhere, pelt them with arrows or charge with their swords. A runestone from Gotland indicates that a group of brothers were slain at one of the rapids, called Eifur. The name has also been corroborated in a Byzantine source. Eventually, the Grand Prince deployed squadrons of cavalry to escort the merchants along the rapid. After leaving the final rapid, the travelers reached the island of St. Gregorius. Here stood a large oak, which the Rus held sacred. According to the Byzantines, they would sacrifice birds here for good fortune. Whether this is true, we know not, but archaeologists have found sets of swords cast into the river. This corresponds to a Germanic tradition of throwing weaponry into bodies of water, as a form of sacrifice. At the mouth of the Dnieper, the travelers stopped at the island of Eiferios, now called Berezan. Here we find a runestone erected by Grane in memory of his comrade, Karl. It dates back to the 11th century. At this island, the boats were rigged with masts and sails, kitted out with steering oars, and loaded up for their final destination. A few Vikings traveled neither by the Lovat, nor the Duna, or even the Dnieper. Rather, they went by the Vistula in present-day Poland. Like the Daugava route, this one seems also to originate from the Amber Road, and our old friends the Gotlanders established a colony here at the mouth, called the Trusho. Through the Vistula, the Dnieper could even be reached via the Pripyat, but the Black Sea could also be reached via the Dniester to the south, or even the Donau. However, this route appears to have not been used very much by the Scandinavians, and archaeological findings are incredibly scarce compared to Eastern Europe. Trusho appears also to have been abandoned by the 10th century, around the same time that the Daugava flourished. Whether a Northman, a Slav, a Balt or a Finn, Constantinople would have been an imposing sight. Imagine living in a small village your entire life, and then entering one of the gigantic cyber cities of our modern world. This is what it must have been like. Birka, often called the largest city in Viking Age Sweden, had an estimated population of around 1,000. Constantinople, 100,000. The Rus lived in hill forts, huts, and longhouses, while Constantinople, an ancient city, housed architectural wonders like the Hippodrome, Imperial Palace, and Hagia Sophia. The Norse called it Egisif, and it was known as the largest and most extravagant church in the world. We can imagine what it was like for them to enter this place of worship. The primary chronicle relates the following. They brought us to the place where they worshipped their god, but we knew not if we were on earth or in heaven. Such wonder and beauty do not exist on this earth. Egisif surely left a lasting impression on its northern visitors, but some wanted to leave a lasting impression themselves. In the marble balustrade, a man named Are simply carved his name and the letter K. What did he mean by this? Other wonders awaited the Rus in the great city. According to the primary chronicle, the Treaty of 911 allowed them access to the baths, exemption from custom dues, and free lodgings. Whilst the Byzantines had no desire for Nordic iron, they surely desired the produce of the Eastern European woodlands. Wax, honey, timber, but also slaves, and especially furs from animals like the fox and beaver. In return, the Rus loaded their boats with fruits, wine, glassware, and silk. Byzantine silk has been found as far away as Dublin, Ireland. There was gold and silver too, but Byzantine coin findings are not nearly as common as Arabic ones. More common in Scandinavia is Byzantine iconography. Though the coins are few in number, Scandinavian mints appear to have been inspired by imperial aesthetics. Some historians even believe that the Scandinavian centralization projects of the 10th and 11th centuries were inspired by the Byzantines. That's not to mention religious influence. Findings of religious icons are numerous, and Byzantine aesthetics inspired some Gotlanders to paint their churches like this. There's even a runestone with a cross, seemingly quite Byzantine. But saying that the Byzantines trusted the Rus would be a stretch. The aforementioned benefits were granted only to merchants, and heavy restrictions were enforced. Trade in Byzantium was strictly regulated, and prices controlled. Some guilds may have had a trading monopoly with the Rus, how the linen traders had a monopoly with the Bulgarians. In 941, 30 years after the initial treaty, the Rus launched another attack on Constantinople. Grand Prince Oleg had died, passing on the title to Igor, his son. Eager to prove himself, no pun intended, Igor led a massive fleet into the Black Sea. Most of the Byzantine fleet was absent, allowing the Rus to ravage along the Bosporus. They gave special attention to the churches, burning them and driving iron nails through the heads of the priests. Said depravities gave the emperor time to prepare. The few ships he had left were mounted with bellows, capable of spewing Greek fire. This terrifying proto-napalm was able to burn on water, setting ships ablaze and scorching any survivors that didn't drown. The attack was a disaster. Igor returned home with a devastated fleet and grumbling Drushina. Unsatisfied by his failure, the Rus levied the service of local tribes, even the Pechenegs, and prepared to launch another attack. Since the Byzantines were also facing a Bulgarian invasion, they were quick to sign a new treaty. The rules of this treaty were considerably stricter. Before, Rus diplomats had to show a gold sigil to enter, and merchants a silver sigil. Now they needed a written license from the Grand Prince himself. Interesting to note about this is that it reveals some form of written literacy among the Rus, and we know that both runes and Old East Slavic was written on items now lost to time, like birch bark. Anyway, the Rus were only allowed residence in the north of the Golden Horn. They could only enter the city through one gate at a time, unarmed and in groups of 50, under escort by an imperial agent. They were not allowed to spend the winter in Byzantium. The treaty was signed by Igor and his close associates, and interestingly, the names are now much more Slavic than in the 911 treaty. When Igor left, he was given gold and silk. But this wasn't enough. The fleet sailed from the Black Sea, up the Don and into the Volga, from whence they entered the Caspian and attacked Abbasid possessions. The eastern route had long been marked by peaceful trade, but would now be supplanted by brutal aggression. Maybe it was the emperor who planted the idea in Igor's head, in order to have a jab at his Muslim rivals. It wouldn't be out of the Byzantine playbook, and we know for certain that he wished to leverage the Rus' energy in his favor. Among the points of the new treaty stood a little clause declaring that the Rus would block the Volga Bulgars from attacking the Greeks and their possessions in Crimea. So the treaty was as much a defensive alliance as it was a trade deal. The Byzantines had a tendency of hiring the Northmen as mercenaries, whom, in the 10th century, they began calling Varangi, Varangians. Throughout the centuries, it basically referred to any Germanic and Slavic barbarians who joined their forces, whether Rus, Swede, Norman, or Englishmen. In 911, 700 of them joined an attack on Crete, and again in 949. They fought the Arabs at the Battle of Hadaf in 955, and joined a Byzantine fleet to Italy in 968. In 988, Prince Vladimir sent a force of 6,000 men, which formed the nucleus of the so-called Varangian Guard. Indeed, most of the Scandinavians in Greece appeared to have been mercenaries. They would come home in extravagant, exotic clothing, and leave behind runestones of their exploits. Their deeds are remembered in the sagas, and among the greatest was Harald Hardrada, king of Norway, who died in battle against the Saxons after attempting to claim their throne. This topic alone is vast and will warrant its own video in the future, and I know some of you have requested it. I previously discussed the religious influence which the Byzantines had in Scandinavia, and of course, this was much more prevalent in Rus and the city of Kiev. The city became the new capital of the Rus for the sake of the Byzantine trade, which increased the rate of conversion, deepening ties with Byzantium, while cutting off ties with the pagan Balts and increasingly Catholic Norse. The first major Rusian to convert was Princess Olga, wife of Oleg. Their son refused to convert, but he was killed in a Pecheneg ambush. The resulting succession crisis ended with Vladimir claiming the throne. Though he initially seemed interested in reforming Slavic paganism into a codified religion, he eventually settled on Christianity. To seal the deal, he married the emperor's sister, forming a long-lasting partnership. With the Kievan Rus solidified, there was suddenly much less interest in trading with distant Scandinavia. Changes were also happening in Scandinavia itself. Sweden and Gotland became enraptured in religious conflicts between pagans and Catholics. Kings were deposed, and peasants rose up against their masters. Scandinavian royalty could often find refuge in Rus, but some were captured by Estonian Vikings along the way. Indeed, the Scandinavian disorder was often exploited by the staunch pagans of the Baltic. The sea had become considerably more dangerous, and the once reliable bridgehead between the east and west, the Daugava, was not as safe as it once had been. Meanwhile, the Christianization of the Norse led to friendlier relations with the West, opening up new opportunities for a valuable and safer trade. All of this is not to say that the route or commerce in the Baltic died. Latvia still flourished, new trading outposts appeared across the Baltic, but there was a significant decline and shift in interests. This shift was especially noticeable in Sweden. While the Gotlanders were quick in adapting to this new world, opening up new trade links with England and Frisia, Sweden was falling into swift decline. Whilst they managed to wrest control over Geatland and had interests in Norway, influence in the east was slipping. Aldegubody had lost its importance. Birka was abandoned in the late 10th century, and in 1017, the peasantry threatened to murder their king if he didn't restore his dominance over the regions of Finland, Kirjaland, Estland, and Kurland. The rest of the century was pocked by dynastic conflicts and religious infighting. In the 1030s, a Swedish prince named Ingvar gathered a fleet and set out east. According to the saga written in his name, he was disappointed over his meager inheritance. However, historians believe that he wanted to reopen the Silk Road, spoken of in my previous video. The scale of this expedition was massive. No less than 35 runestones speak of Ingvar, and the men who died with him in Serkland. It was a disaster. Nothing but a single ship returned. In the next 2 centuries, the Swedes would launch crusades against the Finns, Estonians, and Russians in attempts to restore their influence. Success was marginal. The dream of a Baltic empire had died, at least for now. The route would see some continued use in the 11th and 12th centuries. It became very common to use it when traveling on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. In the 13th century, the Gutha saga tells us how the island had no bishops of its own, so bishops would have to visit the island on their way to the Holy Land. In those times, the saga says, the route went east over Russia and Greece, to Jerusalem. There's even a runestone which commemorates a trip to Jorsala, what the Vikings called Jerusalem. The road was also used by crusaders. The first king to join a crusade was Sigurd of Norway. On his way there he went through Spain and the Strait of Gibraltar, and on his way home, through Greece. The Crusades were another reason behind the decline of the trade route. In the 11th century, the Italian republics began to dominate trade with Byzantium and the Middle East. Oriental goods could be acquired via the Mediterranean. In the Levant, the establishment of the Crusader states opened up new markets for the Western world. And for those wanting to trade with Byzantium through Russia, well, the Novgorodians had something to say about it. Their city had replaced Holmgardur in the 11th century, and by the 12th surpassed Kiev as the greatest city of Rus. The Germans maintained a contour in the city, but they may not have been able to proceed with their ships. In the 11th century, the light ships used by the Varjags were rapidly replaced by the Kog, a larger cargo carrier. As time progressed, all Viking vessels were procedurally replaced by them, and they dominated trade. Whilst effective, the cogs were unable to enter certain waters and rivers, and impossible to portage. So the river to the south lay entirely in the hands of Novgorod. That was when the Mongols came. They flooded Eastern Europe, sacked Kiev, and made tributaries of the princes. Thanks to an early spring, their horses were unable to cross the marshlands into Novgorod. The Republic was subjugated nonetheless, and the route closed for good. In the coming centuries, Russian merchants, farmers, and armies would use the rivers and frozen paths for travel across their country. The Cossacks used them on pirating ventures to the Black Sea and Caspian, and for exploring Siberia. But it was nothing to the international, multicultural greatness of the Östervegur.